Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and Season 2 meta for Mythic Plus Dungeons has so far been outright excellent. Ever since the gutted augmentation, just to make sure that it doesn't get a new play, we've seen the most amount of variety of classes competing at the top end for DPS, healers, and tanks. But at this point, by like what, 3-4 weeks now of Season 2 stuff, we are starting to see that meta kind of crystallize a little bit. We're seeing some of the classes get ahead of others, with some of the better ranged and melee really standing apart from the rest, and are seeing a lot more play whether we're looking at your regular plus 10 weekly dungeons or if you're really trying to push that Mythic Plus content. And for this video, kind of like what we did with Woundwalker somewhat recently, I really wanted to highlight one of the very best, absolutely the very strongest melee class right now for Season 2. Frost Death Knight has maintained dominance back in Season 1, but it looks like it is the season of the Unholy, and the amount of damage these guys do, I mean, Unholy is the only way you can really describe it. So if you are looking to push content within Season 2 and are looking to play the very best melee in the game, this is exactly the reason why you should play Unholy. While this video isn't necessarily a guide, it is a video to highlight one of the stronger options of the season. As always, if you guys want to see more regular updates for Season 2 in War Within, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. Honestly, I really do feel bad kind of dancing on the grave of augmentation for the season. I mean, there's somebody out there that really enjoys the spec, and they're just not viable whatsoever. I don't see anybody play it, at least as of right now. The representation numbers are absolutely in the gutter, but it is crazy just how one spec being there for a season allows so many to flourish. We've seen so much variety, so many different classes actually looking competitive. And while we are going to cover Unholy, it doesn't mean that the meta has solidified completely. Keep in mind, the meta still has a lot of variance to it. Certain comps actually work out alright with other melee and other DPS classes in general. It doesn't mean Unholy Death Knight is the only viable option this season, but it's definitely a very strong one. And while this isn't necessarily a guide, I am going to go over what makes Unholy Death Knight super strong. And in case you want to give it a go, starting with the talents. The talents in particular is where I think if you've been playing Death Knight for any other expansion prior to this one, or if you've been playing it for multiple years now, Unholy has always been a master of partially diseases, partially the ghoulish companions that it get to summon, usually in big multitudes, in hordes in fact, as well as its own strikes and its own damage. But this build, it really completely eliminates like a third of its identity outright completely. The build itself, if you notice, down the middle, all the Summoner and Death Knight army undead talents are completely just removed out of the system for this build, which is super unusual. This is going to be one of the weirder builds on Death Knights that ends up kind of taking that out of this, I guess, equation, but then leans heavily into everything else that it can do. The diseases, the shadow damage, the big epidemic goes, and a lot of that, the completely missing structure of undeads is kind of made up by San Lan, as it helps enhance all of the other counterparts that you heavily invest into. It's a pretty big shift in terms of mindset, but you're basically going to be heavy on diseases, epidemics, death coils, and Scourge Strike at the target. Really amping up the damage of Scourge Strike heavily because San Lan does a lot of heavy lifting. So besides maintaining diseases on the target, the build also has a number of components as part of its gameplay, one of them being Plaguebringer, so you want to maintain a Scourge Strike to maintain the effectiveness of your diseases essentially at all times, so that they are always empowered, always doing the most amount of damage possible. You also, during downtime, will be focused on spreading Festering Wounds on multiple targets, especially since you can cleave those things down fairly easily with your Scourge Strike based gameplay, plus sudden due procs of Death Coil also get to pop Festering Wounds as well. You also get to spread Festering Wounds passively just by dropping Death Decay on a target through the talent of Pestilence, which will just pop them up on the target automatically. Combines really well with San Lan. Although another way that you'll be able to spread Festering Wounds during downtime is with the Festering Sight ability. After popping 20 Festering Wounds, your next strike will instead be like a cleaving AoE strike that spreads Festering Wounds to multiple targets very quickly. So it allows you to deal just a decent bit of like overall damage during that downtime with a couple of these components included together. However, heavy lifting is being done by the San Lan base gameplay. San Lan really does end up kind of completing this entire package because on its own, this build just It's good for dots and it's good for maintaining good damage, but Sunland really helps amplify it in a variety of ways. The Vampiric Strike offered from Sunland is massive for the damage that it does, and together with Gift of Sunland, during Dark Transformation, you have Vamp Strike available at all times. This ability becomes your priority ability as it does a number of things, from being able to build up a haste buff with the Blood of the Queen. The actual damage of Vamp Strike is massive, and when you combine it together with talents such as Rotten Touch, that damage could be further amplified. During Death and Decay, you're also cleaving multiple targets with a Vamp Strike that hits for a solid bit. It also does a lot of healing, as it makes Unholy Death Knights fairly sustainable and survivable. The blood beast you summon with Blood is Life is also pretty amazing. That thing can do a ton of damage. It builds damage as it deals damage, and when it explodes, it just deals a portion of the damage it did, collected, accumulated, and then just spreads it to multiple targets. So this adds an extra layer of AoE damage. Another element is Vamp Strike can also prolong the duration of your Virulent Plague, extending it and then consuming it, allowing that damage to be immediately compressed, which is a huge other element of this overall playstyle. That basically means that the Vamp Strike ability, once you set it up correctly, does almost everything for you. Summoning blood monstrosities, extending your dots, consuming them to deal a ton of damage, powering up your haste, consuming all of your festering wounds that are automatically applied through Death and Decay and through procs of Festering Scythe. In fact, I would even argue the downtime of the spec has more complication behind it than the actual burst window with the Dark Transformation and spamming that Vamp Strike. It takes a little bit of time to learn how to set it up properly, but the actual burst window is super simple. You're spamming Vamp Strike as your priority ability and spending your runes on either your epidemics or death calls, especially when you're trying to respond to sudden doom procs. But with the tier set, it is usually better just to spam out as many runic power abilities as possible, and all you're trying to do is chain Death and Decays in between of that. So the actual burst window is super fast paced, it's a visceral, it does a ton of damage, and for the most part all you're doing is responding to procs. Sudden doom procs, hey, that gives you an idea, okay, I probably should hit my epidemic or death coil. When your Scourge Scythe glows, that means you should send it as soon as possible. Death and Decay, slam those as much as you can and just spam out as many buttons as possible. And it is kind of spammy because you're just mostly hitting that Vamp Strike again and again and again until you literally cannot. But the fact that the ability does so much for you with so many different like moving parts, I find really cool in the season. Now, when gearing this beast, it does take you a little bit of stats. You need a lot of haste on this playstyle, and I definitely don't have enough on my Death Knight as of this moment, but it requires a ton of haste. It gets a lot of artificial haste from the whole Sandland based gameplay, but it needs a lot of it. Then it also needs a lot of mastery, and those are the two stats that you should invest the most into. From there, it looks like versatility is only slightly ahead of crit, or depending on certain builds, people have stack a little bit of crit, a little bit of versa, but not a lot. Majority of it is going to be a giga amounts of haste, giga amounts of mastery in order to get this build online. Though when it comes to gear specifically, the only hard part of getting a Death Knight properly online will be the trinkets. This class plays around a 1.5 minute CD window. Most classes are constructed as a 2-minute class or as a 3-minute class, and a lot of the trinkets, items, and all these things usually are structured around those classes. Then there's only a handful of few specs in the game that are a 1.5 minute class. Let's give them a slightly different window because it kind of gives them like a half a burst. It's kind of like a 3-minute class, but that has a decent half burst in between, or a class that can send their cooldowns a little faster than a 2-minute class. But they're structured in such a weird way, and usually it takes very specific items to gear them how you need to. Unholy DK plays around a 45-second window Dark Transformation. 2 of those becomes a 1.5 minute window with Unholy Assault. So you are a 1.5 minute class with 45-second cooldown in between to use. It is nice in dungeons like that. Gives you, it's not quite as long as a minute class, which sometimes feels like a little constrained in certain instances. And with the 45 seconds, you have cooldowns all the time. So it's kind of nice, but gearing this thing becomes a bit of a pain. There is an item you basically need in order to start playing this, and that is House of Cards, a trinket that lines up perfectly with it being a 1.5 minute class, with a trinket on a 1.5 minute cooldown that grants you a load of mastery, which is your must-have stat. It's perfect, but it does require you to raid if you really want to put this thing online. There are some alternatives, like you could technically use a Delve trinket of Funhouse Lens, also on a 1.5 minute cooldown, which is okay, and I guess it's better than nothing, but Also, it becomes a bit of a problem of gearing the spec in general, because even with that trinket being a Delve random drop or House of Cards, good luck trying to get that one in the raid of Undermine without somebody trying to yoink it and then sell it back to you, which is happening right now in PvE. It is very difficult to gear a Death Knight because those items are kind of necessary in order to get the most out of the burst that this spec can offer. But if you do get lucky enough with these items, which are pretty much mandatory, then this spec is insanely fun. It just is a little bit hard to gear, but the payoff is amazing. Overall, playing on Holy DK in this season, the damage profile is actually kind of insane. You have great AoE damage, but you give up a lot of single target damage. You don't really have any burst cooldowns or anything like that with your army to deal decent single target. It is awesome enough, but it's not amazing. You are really focused in on doing as much AoE damage as humanly possible, primarily within big cooldowns. Dungeons like Theater or Pain are not your best friend, but anything like Cinderbrew Meadery, lots of mobs at the start, it is perfect. Mechagon, where you can do a lot of big pulls, also pretty perfect. Then there's also things like Motherload is fantastic. Priory is really good. Rookery has a couple of decent big pulls that you can do. And in any of those number of instances, it is basically your best situation. But your single target and smaller target damage is going to be suffering a little bit just because of the way that the build is constructed. With you being a 45-second or a 1.5 minute cooldown, it doesn't feel like you have to wait for your cooldowns ever. They're short enough where it feels like you always have a go. So you never really have any noticeable downtime on the spec, though with you being so AoE heavy, it does encourage really big AoE pulls. And for some of the dungeon groups, in order to be able to maximize the value of an Unholy Death Knight, you will have to go for slightly bigger pulls just because of Unholy. Because of the way that their damage scales in AoE with the ability of Epidemic, which actually I'm so glad it became a baseline ability as part of your spellbook instead of a talented ability. But with Epidemic, you are able to deal damage to multiple targets, but the more enemies that are stacked together, the more damage you get to do, causing an enemy to take additional shadow damage and to all other enemies for even more shadow damage, which also helps increase the duration of your Dark Transformation by 1 second. So essentially, the more enemies you have in a pool, the more damage you do. So where other classes have a soft cap or some sort of an AoE hard cap, the more enemies you get to pull in, the more value you get out of it as Unholy, which was really what sets them apart from other melee classes in terms of just the raw AoE damage. This combined with the damage of Defile, this combined with the way that they can cleave with their Vam Strike to multiple targets, the way that their Bursting Swords pop when using Festering Strike and how that deals damage to multiple other foes, and all the other components that you've added here. It's a ton of overall damage through the AoE of this spec in general. All those diseases, all those eruptions, all those epidemics, everything combines together for some insane AoE damage. But the group does need to be a little bit more courageous when pulling big pulls, or being able to pull at least a lot of like non-threatening enemies on top of threatened enemies, focusing down on threats and letting Death Knight cleave everything for free, because that's where they're going to get the most value out of it. And Death Knights also bring quite a lot of value within dungeons compared to the newest raid of Undermine. Apparently, the way the Blizzard looks at Death Knights is grips is the big component that Death Knights bring to raid content, although Death Knights didn't really get too much play within raids. Grips can be useful, but unless you create mechanics where things need to be gripped, Death Knights don't really get a lot of play because of that. So it's a bit of a controversial thing about Death Knights. Like, do they actually bring a raid buff to a raid roster? Because Blizzard says they do, but some would argue that not really. It doesn't really feel like they do. While sometimes Death Knights don't feel like they bring a raid buff, quote unquote, into a raid, that raid buff of grip does work its way into Mythic Plus dungeons very well, because there's so many enemies that can be grouped around. So while this may be a controversial take when it comes to raid content, it continues to be an incredibly good tool within Mythic Pluses, at least as of this moment. Just being able to group up enemies together or group those pesky casters out of range into melee so they can be easier interrupted or CC'd is super nice. Just bringing a Death Knight, I feel like just having them reposition mobs all close and personal, or at least bunch them up together and group them up with things like grip or Abomination Limb has been awesome. Just something I value greatly, and I think this is one of those things that players don't talk about enough when it comes to Death Knights in Mythic Pluses. An insanely cool tool that really gives Death Knights, I think, a bit of an edge within Mythic Plus content. It's just a huge quality of life improvement. Outside of this, Battle Res is fantastic, everybody needs one. Insidious Chill, even though it's not the strongest variation of this type of a debuff, it can be helpful for your tank, decreasing enemies' attack speed by up to 20% for 30 seconds. That can be useful in helping your tank have a bit more survivability. Technically, you could bring a Warlock or a Rogue with the right poison in order to get a similar effect, or potentially even a better one. But Insidious Chill still is a good debuff to bring either way. Anti-Magic Shell continues to be a very broken button. Love it, especially on bosses like second boss of Rookery, where you can just completely AMS absorb the debuff that bounces all over everybody in that group, and you could just have Death Knight absorb it once and not have to worry about it. Less strain for your healer, less strain for your group to have to position so they can bounce that debuff accordingly amongst everybody. Also, the defensive value that Death Knights bring into group content between Anti-Magic Zone or things like Vestigial Shell, I think are awesome. I am glad that they gotten quite a bit of that group utility in order to at least help deal with magic damage for their group. So I'm a huge fan of this type of utility being brought in. And even talents like Grip of the Dead, I feel like in this season in particular, are super useful. Just being able to slow down enemy movement speed by 90%. That eventually does decay, but that constant proper slowing effect with constant uses of Death and Decay that Unholy has just adds towards the control with the Mythic Plus content. So I guess what I'm trying to say is Unholy Death Knights bring so much to the team within M+ dungeons that makes them better, not just in raw damage, but in those extra additional utilities. I think the damage definitely carries a lot of that weight, especially with the whole Sin Lane disease AoE based gameplay, but all that extra utility I do believe makes dungeons, at least in this current season, just a little bit easier as of this moment. I think the only dungeon Death Knights may potentially even struggle in is possibly Theater of Pain, just because you don't have as many big pulls for you to utilize all of this AoE damage on, but every other dungeon in the season has definitely allowed Death Knights to propel themselves above most other melee classes. So if you haven't picked up on a Holy Death Knight, or been looking for a very strong melee to get into for Mythic Plus dungeons, Frost Death Knight was really good in Season 1, so if you played Frost back then, now you can just switch over to Unholy and then continue the DK dominance heading into Season 2. But with that, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching and hope you guys did enjoy this update. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give it a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our community, probably the best place to keep up with all of the newest class patch notes or changes for the season. Also, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.